Hello, welcome to MIT Russia. I'm Kate Brown, Professor of Science, Technology, and Society, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, Soviet and Russian Space Exploration, Celebrity and Propaganda, 1957 to the present. And we're coming up on the 60-year anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's flight into space. And across Europe, but especially in Russia, this is a big event. This event will be recorded and later posted to YouTube, and it is sponsored by the MIT Russia and Eurasia program, which is currently celebrating its 10th year at MIT. Please note that the MIT Russia program will also be co-sponsoring two other events this month. One is Advice for President Biden, dealing with Putin's Russia, at the MIT Star Forum with Andrei Kortunov and Angela Stent on Monday, April 12th at noon. And MIT's own astronaut, a graduate, we'll have a conversation with him, Aero Astro alumnus Michael Finke on Tuesday, April 20th at 5 p.m. Today, however, we have, and it's my great pleasure to have Andrew Jenks and Victoria Smolkin, who will discuss the memory of Soviet space celebrity Yuri Gagarin and the waxing and waning of space heroism and its public functions. Please, during the course of this presentation, turn off your mics or put them on mute. And we will take questions not through the chat function, but through the Q&A function. So about our speakers, Victoria Smolkin is Associate Professor of History at Wesleyan University. She is author of A Sacred Space is Never Empty, A History of Soviet Atheism, and that's Princeton Press, 2018. Smolkin's interests extend to utopianism and how it figures time and space through engagements with death and cosmic exploration. Our other speaker is Andrew Jenks. He's a professor of history at Cal State University, Long Beach. He's the author of a biography of Yuri Gagarin, the cosmonaut who couldn't stop smiling. And he also has a new book coming out, When the Space Race Ended, Collaboration in Space and the Search for Peace on Earth. And that's soon going to come out with Anthem Press. So I'm delighted we have a lot of participants today and we want to get right on to the presentations. We're going to first start with Andrew Jenks, who's going to talk about Gagarin's life, and that'll be followed by a presentation by Victoria.
Hello. Hi. Well, thank you very much for that introduction and also for having me at this great occasion to celebrate, but also to analyze and talk about Yuri Gagarin. So I'm going to, without further ado, start my screen, share my screen, and I have some slides I want to share to make my points. And so I'm starting them right now. So hopefully this is visible. I think we're good to go. So let me talk about Yuri Gagarin in two ways. The way that he actually was versus the myth of Gagarin. And this is something I deal with in my biography, sort of studying two different Gagarins, so to speak, the sacred one, the profane one, and then trying to figure out the relationship between those two. And I want to talk in particular about this distinction between the sacred and the profane in terms of, in Russian, two terms. This actually comes from the late Svetlana Boym and her wonderful work on Soviet culture and space and so many other things in nostalgia. And she talks about a distinction in Russian culture between what you might say is everyday life, or byt in Russian, and sort of an exalted life on a higher plane, bytia. It's the difference between the everyday sort of boring things that we have to do, the profane things, versus life on a higher plane that has greater meaning. And I think that when I think about Gagarin's spaceflight, April 12th, 1961, what he does essentially is he goes from everyday existence, byt, to this higher plane of bytia. And this also had great significance if we think about Gagarin's childhood, growing up in an extremely impoverished area in Western Russia, that was under Nazi occupation during World War II. And he was a child of the 17th Party Congress in 1934. He sort of, when he went into space, he moved from Bhut to Bhitya. He transcended the poverty, the, in many ways, humiliating conditions, particularly under Nazi occupation. And then he went into this higher realm. And I think that for many Russians, the way that he transcended his existence at this kind of base, impoverished world into something higher fulfilled the promise of a more general kind of transcendence that was embedded within the revolution. And it also made him into a kind of Jesus-like figure, someone that had ascended into the heavens and connected our mundane daily life to something that had higher meaning. Now, of course, the tragedy of Gagarin and of anyone who goes into space is that you have to come back. And coming back can always be, re-entry can always be a very traumatic experience in all sorts of different ways. Now, here is a picture from the museum devoted to Gagarin in the place where he grew up in Gzhatsk, which is actually named after Gagarin after his flight. So it is Gzhatsk/Gagarin. And here you see Gagarin flying above the impoverished circumstances in which he grew up. And this is actually, I think, a play on a famous painting by Marc Chagall, Flying Over Vitebsk, where you have this idea of sort of transcending the conditions of everyday life. And spaceflight did this, right? And then I think this is what produces the mythological and also sacred potential of spaceflight. But of course, there's always a tension between the sacred and the profane. So I'm going to make a couple points about these tensions right now. Here I am in Saratov, where Gagarin studied in technical college, and by coincidence, not too far away from here is where he landed. And there is a substantial sort of commemoration and museum in his honor there. And what the main picture here in the museum represents Gagarin right after he lands, looking very confident and fresh, right beside his capsule. And in fact, this image is a lie because Gagarin did not land in his capsule, but he landed a few kilometers away. And the Soviet Union maintained the lie in order to convey the idea that it had capabilities that in fact it didn't have to land a human being on the ground inside the capsule. And so I turned to the director of the museum here, and I asked her, look, we've known for quite a long time that Gagarin didn't land in his capsule. And why do you continue to tell this story, right? And she looked at me and she said, well, it looks better that way. And I think that's the difference between sacred and profane history. The sacred history, which very often is based on a lie, not always, is simply more attractive and more interesting, perhaps, or serves particular political or social purposes than the real story. And that, of course, is something that I investigate in my biography of Gagarin, these tensions between the sacred and the profane Gagarin. So here's a sort of backing up from that image. Gagarin landing in his capsule, that wasn't true. Gagarin being met by a collective farm worker immediately, that wasn't true. Gagarin being located and met immediately by a rescue team, that was not true. So here we have sacred history, but sacred history based on untruths. The next image is actually an attempt by the museum to tell the real story. And so the artist who painted the original painting was commissioned again to do another painting, and this time to represent Gagarin as he actually was. And in fact, a little bit dazed and confused, very dazed and confused after reentry and apart from his capsule. And the artist himself couldn't bring himself to actually show Gagarin frowning. He had to have that smile. And you can see there's an attempt to sort of deal with, work around the mouth area. But he never finished the painting and he died before he could complete it. And the painting, as a result, is locked away in the basement of the museum. So that in other words, the real history, the profane history, there was an attempt to try to integrate that into the celebration of Gagarin in the museum. but they could never bring themselves to actually replace the earlier painting with this one, which remained incomplete. Another aspect of this tension between the myth or the cult of Gagarin and the real one, in Saratov, they have a movement in the post-Soviet era. This shows you something of the functionality, utility of the cult to this day. And it's called, it gives an award to someone who writes an essay that celebrates the sober and healthy lifestyle of Gagarin. And so that Gagarin becomes sort of someone you want to imitate. You want to be like him. But the him that you want to be like is someone who is sober, someone who is always responsible and faithful to his wife. And here's an example of an essay that was written that won that prize. And it said, a project for Gagarinites and a healthy style of life in the pedagogical educational process. So using Gagarin as an example of how to conduct yourself in a healthy fashion. And of course, the problem with this is that the real Gagarin liked to drink quite a bit. And in fact, he suffered from alcoholism. So again, you see this tension between the sacred and the profane. Here's another example of this. So this is an issue from the early 2000s, and this is the Cosmonaut Pavilion from VDNH, which was the exhibit center in the Soviet Union. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was turned into a flea market for gardening tools. And you can see in the very end of the hallway, a round image. That was the image of Gagarin. And it is covered in this case, as I take the photo, with a banner that is advertising the selling of gardening implements. So here you see a sacred Soviet space celebrating the cosmos turned into something very terrestrial, quite literally, into a place for selling gardening tools and plants. And the contrast between the sacred and profane. Now, when I took this picture, actually, they were getting ready, Putin was, to reconfigure VDNH again as a sacred space. And they were kicking out all the vendors that were at the pavilion. And now it looks like this today. It has been re-sacralized, which I think is an indication of the revival of the Gagarin cult and the way in which his sacred image has once again been reconstructed after a kind of a period of extreme demise during the collapse of the Soviet Union in the horrific 1990s. And Putin has put Humpty Dumpty, sacred Soviet Union and history back together, at least a version of it. And now Cosmos and Gagarin's story have become usable history in a political sense. And I think that also indicates why the 60th anniversary of Gagarin's feat is so important. It involves a kind of resacralization of space exploration as a fundamental part of modern Russian political identity. Okay, again, I just want a couple of other contrasts, and then I'll leave it at this between the sacred and the profane. This is outside of Gagarin's home where he grew up in Gzhatsk. And it's displays the car that he was awarded after his flight into space. And here's a kind of connection between Beat and Beatia, right? And so he gets a Soviet car, which is pretty privileged thing to have had at that particular juncture. But in fact, the car he liked to ride was this car. And it was gifted to him by the French aerospace company Matra. And this was a fiberglass car, cutting edge kind of material and technology for that time. But Gagarin himself couldn't be too public in driving this car because it upset people in the political circles that expected him, I ran ahead of myself here, to drive this car. Again, the sacred and the profane. In this case, the profane is the snazzy Western sports car, and the sacred is the more dumpy looking Soviet car. Okay. I'm going to finish up with a couple of images. And this is from round about 2012. And I think it indicates something of the state of Russia at that point. And it's an image of Yuri Gagarin, the statue, and it has scribbled on it, this bust, Yuri, we effed it all up. And I liken this to sort of an image of Jesus, perhaps, that that Yuri embodies our hopes and dreams for a better future. And that if we can live up to the promise of the mythical sacred Gagarin, then we have fulfilled the Russian promise, Russian destiny. And at this particular juncture, whoever scribbled this, it conveyed the idea that we have not lived up to that promise. Oh, Jesus, we have failed you. Oh, Gagarin, we have failed you. So circa, let's say 2011, 2012, a sense of failure. But here's an update of that image. And this is, again, in Gagarin's, an image of Gagarin that's put onto a wall. And it's much different. In this case, it says, Yura, my ispravilis. Yuri, we did it. We didn't F it up. We actually did it. We accomplished the goals that we needed to accomplish. We lived up to to the promise embedded within that flight on April 12th, 1961. And here you can see the very dynamic functions of the Gagarin cult. And of course, the question is, what is the it? What's the it that has been done? And you can see a couple of hints of that here. So one of the its is Crimea. Zato Krim Nash, right? That, well, whatever else has happened in Russia, at least Crimea is now back in Russia. So that's one of the things that involve sort of fulfilling Yuri's promise, is reacquiring Crimea. And then there's an image of the revival of the civilian aerospace industry. And there is a jetliner project with China, mid-level jetliner project that embodies many of the hopes for a Russian entry into the civilian jetliner market around the world. Oil, energy, and then Russian peacekeepers giving food to children. All of this means that we have fulfilled the promise of Yuri Gagarin. So I'm going to leave it at that. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Andy, for that. Really fascinating. We've got lots to talk about. Now we're going to hear from Victoria Smolkin about the memory and of the space program. Thank you. Take it over, Victoria.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen to get into the place where we are all supposed to be. Yeah, there we are. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for organizing this event, and thank you so much for inviting me to take part in it. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to reflect again on the meaning of this occasion, but also to think about looking at cosmic utopianism in a broader context, in both kind of in the Soviet context, in the late Soviet context, and then in the post-Soviet context. So what I'm going to do today is kind of think about why it was that this particular event, that this particular figure of the cosmonaut, and that this phenomenon of the space race actually embodied so many of the kind of utopian longings of the Soviet project. And what I'm going to do is look at how science and religion, in this case, actual religion, were constructed as opposing forces, and how this narrative was conveyed through the Soviet space program, and in particular, the role of the cosmonaut as a figure to communicate this narrative in particular, and then look at how that actually maps onto political and scientific utopianism more broadly. Because what I want to show is that beyond the sphere of religion and atheism, we can see cosmic utopianism and communism as two distinct projects that actually reinforce each other and play a really important role. So I'm starting with this meme, and I'll come back to it at the end. But what you see here is, in a way, the kind of the life cycle of cosmic utopianism, or at least one narrative of that life cycle. It begins with the Leninist electrification grid. It continues with Sputnik. It reaches its apogee with Gagarin, and it falls into a kind of perhaps kind of dystopian decline with nuclear energy or nuclear power. And I think the evocation here, of course, is Chernobyl, right? So there's this kind of, I don't know if people here are familiar with this kind of meme genre, right? But there's this kind of, announcing of atheism and electrification as an event, Sputnik as a kind of wow moment, right? The kind of we've accomplished something new and different. Gagarin as a kind of triumphal kind of ha ha ha, we did it. And then somehow things go off the rail. Things go off the kind of optimistic, heroic narrative that that was envisioned. And so Gagarin is not supposed to be followed by, by what you see in the fourth panel. We could talk about what should be in the fourth panel according to the kind of ideological structure. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of point out the significance of cosmism and cosmic utopianism as it connects to the revolution. And what I'm showing here is a quite famous painting by the painter Konstantin Yon called New Planet, and as well as his painting from 1929 entitled People of the Future. And what I want to say by showing these paintings from the early Soviet period is that the revolution of 1917 was understood as something far bigger than politics and actually far bigger than Russia. So rather it was understood as a kind of a planetary event, right? Not a national event, not even an international event, but a planetary event with cosmic significance. So in representing the revolution, Yuan is actually representing the birth of a new planet and the birth of a new people of the future, a radical rupture with the old world and with all of its attending structures and beliefs. So this new world is filled with new people, and these new people are flying. And I think this kind of moment of flying is really key here because it becomes the embodiment of radical rupture. Not only are they breaking with the old world, right? Not only is the revolution breaking with history and with the past, but it's breaking with the laws of nature and with gravity itself, right? It's this kind of radical rupture, radical freedom, radical human emancipation. So what you have is the kind of beginning of a narrative of progress without limits, right? This kind of optimism without limits. And this is the utopia that was envisioned after the revolution. But of course, there were many, many things that stood in its way. Capitalism, imperialism, and what's important for this presentation, religion. So if the Soviet project was about bringing about a new planet and new people, and you follow this to its logical conclusion, then the world that was supposed to be brought about would look something like this world. But it's worth noting that this wasn't just a kind of pure fantasy, but really something that fueled a lot of the very practical technological projects that kind of ultimately brought about Soviet space conquest. So one of the, as I said, one of the main things that stood in the way of the building of this new world and of the kind of liberation or emancipation or creation of these new people was religion. And science was kind of cast as the opposite of religion. You have this in this image here, a Manichaean kind of representation of the world, a world divided into two parts. One side is light, the other side is darkness. On the left side, you see a priest looking up into the heavens, and it says what the priests see in the sky. And they are seeing, angels and other and kind of deities and other figments of their imagination. And on the right, you have science, what we see, right? And we are associated with science, with enlightenment. And I think significantly, you see a telescope, right? We are associated with, which is represented as power, right? So this kind of science and technology as light, as truth, and as power. And this narrative really becomes foundational to the way that the Soviet project is structured ideologically, but also communicated to the people. And you see this quite clearly in the construction, for example, of the planetarium as an institution. And so here you have the Moscow Planetarium, which was the first of its kind, and it was constructed at the end of the 1920s and really kind of began its operations in the 1930s. And it was actually called an anti-religious astronomical lecture theater. So what was supposed to happen was that you were supposed to come to the planetarium as you would to a sacred space, to be transformed, to be endowed with a new worldview, and to become this new person, right? So this was not just a kind of passive experience, but really something that was supposed to turn you into this new man or new human. But if you wanted to do this on a mass scale, to enact that project on a mass scale, then you have to build many planetaria, right? All of the Soviet people cannot all show up to the Moscow planetarium to be transformed. So this project has to be expanded, and it's expanded actually by turning to churches as institutions, as buildings, as sacred spaces, and actually transforming them into planetaria, right? So the vast majority of planetaria in the Soviet Union were actually in former churches. And one reason for that is quite practical. The cupola works quite well and doesn't require, a huge kind of reconstruction project. But the other, of course, is exactly what Andy was pointing to, which is this transfer of the kind of inversion of sacred and profane. So the planetaria become the sacred spaces that are supposed to take the place of the church, both symbolically, but also physically. But also the churches in this way are becoming profane by turning into a planetarium. And so in the image we have many more examples of this kind of process, right? So here we have this Nizhny Novgorod example, but we have many more examples of the process across the Soviet Union. And not only is the planetarium a sacred space, but cosmic themes begin to appear at the center of Soviet ideology, including atheist ideology. And the Scientific Atheist Campaign explicitly ties science to a kind of to the atheist project, as we can see here most prominently in the very first issue of the Soviet atheist journal Science and Religion, which depicts the monument to the conquerors of space, perhaps the most famous monument to the Soviet space project. But here it's actually in 1959, so it's not even yet constructed. It's just the project of it, but it's already being depicted on the cover as the central symbol of atheist propaganda. And here is the actual, once it's actually constructed, what you see. And so here in 1963, it's accompanied by a quote that says, "Religious understandings of the world appear like hazy fantasies in light of scientific progress," right? So this kind of transformation was very much kind of explicit in the project. So enter Gagarin, right? So we have this moment in which the kind of utopian or cosmic utopia and political utopia begin to come together. You see here a cosmonaut, kind of Gagarin in space again, and you see this kind of new Russian or new man, and in this case, a Russian man in space. As a kind of new people. And it's interesting to note here that unlike the earlier people of the future, this one is hearkening back to all sorts of traditional Russian themes. So this kind of a nationalist visual vocabulary at play. And of course, as we know, it wasn't just Russian men, it was also Russian women. And I think here again, you notice Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, but she has this kind of traditional Russian head garb, to kind of connect her very explicitly to Russia as and not just to the Soviet project. But this idea of technology and religion being in opposition, and this moment being the moment in which the first triumphs over the second, is really key. And here you have this book, which was a kind of popular atheist book called Technology and Religion, in which the reader is told that despite all of religion's predictions, prohibitions, persecutions, humanity has broken through to the heavens. Now rockets and Sputniks that were created by people who have uncovered the laws of nature and subjugated its great power travel to the infinite expanses of the universe. So this idea, right, of radical emancipation and radical kind of overcoming of nature, this kind of high modernist dream, is really in this point being depicted as a reality, right? You're no longer in the realm of fantasy. And what was supposed to happen was that this kind of becoming a reality, that the Soviet people entering the heavens was supposed to do two things. One, it was supposed to undermine the belief of religious people in the very foundations of their belief in God. And it was also supposed to produce atheist conviction. So here you have this, one of my favorite in this genre of atheist paintings. It's a priest who is sitting there, and it's called Deep in Thought. And he has a newspaper on his desk announcing the first flight of Gagarin. And he's, presumably questioning his faith as a result. And then on the other hand, right, that this would then endow Soviet people with the courage to embrace kind of science and their own kind of human emancipation project. So here you have a young woman and in a poster that says "To light, to knowledge," with a Sputnik behind her, and she's tearing off that cross, right? So she's kind of on the other side of that deep thought that the priest is in. So how this message was communicated more broadly was to kind of begin, what you see is religion becomes a kind of a point of ridicule in the propaganda, because it's become something that is no longer necessary, that is obsolete, that is backward. So here you have a depiction in the Soviet satirical journal Crocodile of God essentially asking the cosmonauts if they need a guard for their space station because he's out of a job, right? So he's kind of looking for work. Or, and this is perhaps the most famous depiction, is the famous anti-religious poster in which it just has a cosmonaut, a red cosmonaut, and it says "There is no God." And then underneath you have you could see the tops of religious buildings, religious spaces, sacred spaces, and they're tipping over. Now they're not gone, but they're falling over under the weight of this new scientific accomplishment. So they're on their way out. And I want to just kind of quickly point out that this is very close to the painting that you saw in Andy's presentation, where, Gagarin there is flying over backwardness in the form of kind of village life. Here he's flying over backwardness, or the cosmonaut is flying over backwardness in the form of religious belief. Okay, so this kind of utopian ideal of humanity, Soviet humanity in particular, breaking with gravity, expanding the domain of humankind to space, utopia, and this moment of it kind of seeming to become real, it's not unambivalent, because of course, as many Soviet people knew in their day-to-day life, their life did not actually look like the kind of utopian ideals that were propagated. And here you have, for example, an image from the Soviet magazine Technology and Youth. And here again, you see, and this is from 1949, and you see, that here there's kind of young people in flying cars. So they're not quite cosmonauts, but they're in flight. But what I want to note in particular is what you see if you look all the way to the back. And that is the Palace of Soviets. And what's important about the Palace of Soviets was that the Palace of Soviets was perhaps the most ambitious project of utopian architecture in the Soviet Union. However, it was never actually constructed. So it was projected, and it actually was supposed to take the place of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which stands in the center of Moscow. The cathedral was blown up in 1931 in order to make way for it. It actually stood empty for many, many years. And here you have a parade kind of walking by the space that says, instead of the hearth of the opiate of the people, there's a palace, right? Except that it never actually got built. So what you're looking at here in these technology and youth projections or images are actually kind of projections of fantasy and imagination. So this actually is being depicted as real, as having been constructed, when in fact it wasn't. So you were simultaneously kind of accomplishing a utopia, but also showing a kind of ghostly longing for the utopian project. So then kind of to return, and I'll kind of wrap up here, this kind of narrative of conquest over nature, of radical human emancipation, it left a very ambivalent legacy, and I think it really is captured in this kind of image. And so on the one hand, you have this continued persistent attachment to the space program, and you see this in Andy's presentation so well, and to the symbols associated with it as symbols of hope, as symbols of possibility. But also it's a symbol of disappointment, right? Of a kind of utopia that never actually came into being, that the kind of the fourth panel was not supposed to stop with nuclear power. It was supposed to continue on into expanding the cosmos. And so here, you have that kind of ambivalence, but like Andy pointed out with his, Yuri, we fixed it meme, you do have a kind of moment of reclaiming the optimism that's quite recent. And here, of course, one of the main things that you can point to is the revival of Sputnik for the vaccine, for the COVID-19 vaccine, Sputnik 5. But then also even this kind of, again, this meme that is also Yuri, we're fixing it, in which Yuri at the beginning is saying, hi descendants, how are you guys doing? Are you conquering space, right? Because that was the expectation. And then the second panel just says, the Pentagon is afraid of a Russian attack from space. And then you have Yuri at the bottom two panels saying, good job, guys, kind of good work. And so Yuri, we are kind of fixing it, is this kind of reclaiming of power, in this case, quite directly military power, and taking back a kind of supremacy in the global geopolitical context. So that's all for me. I will stop sharing, and I'd be delighted to chat and hear questions.
Thank you so much. Andy, if you could come back on screen, we'd love to see you too as we take questions. I am really amazed that here on a program about cosmonauts and spaceflight, that both of you dwell on religion and the sacred. And I'd just like to take the prerogative of having the first question, lifting off from the limits of what Earth offers into the heavens is, you're both pointing out, a sacred endeavor. So we can use, as you've shown, especially you, Victoria, how the desire to go into space tells us a lot about beliefs about religion. Can we flip that question for both of you? How does the belief in religion and sort of transcending the limits of human bodies on Earth into sort of a heavens or a paradise, what does that tell us about space programs or techno-utopianism in general?
I'll take a quick stab at that. The way I see it, I mean, this is part of my most recent project on collaboration in space, tries to think about precisely this issue. And I think that what I've discovered is that there are kind of two camps, or two different ways that people see space flight. And there's one view that's kind of more grounded in traditional strategic, military strategic concerns, and that referred to as cosmopolitics, where you expand national and military and economic prerogatives from Earth into space, so that the colonization of space becomes a reproduction of the same kind of patriarchal and power structures back on Earth. But then there is a sort of utopian aspect of space flight that sees space as a way of transcending those very ways of doing things back on Earth. And I think that is a kind of dynamic tension built within every space program, that both those motives actually operate side by side. The desire to transcend, and at the same time, the desire to expand terrestrial power in traditional ways into space. And I think that we can even see that replicated, by the way, in cyberspace. The utopian sort of idea that cyberspace would mark a moment of transcendence of the horrible way we do things back on Earth, the creation of new kinds of communities versus the expansion of troll farms and of the NSA and snooping and surveillance. And then, of course, the politics that we've seen that begin to colonize cyberspace. And so it's not one or the other, it's actually both simultaneously, which is what makes it so fascinating.
Thank you. Victoria, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy did a terrific job of kind of mapping it out. And I think the only thing I would add is that the utopian project is oftentimes used to kind of not just alongside, but as a cover for the political project. So it's not, it seems kind of about emancipation and humankind, right? And freedom, but it actually is mostly funded by and driven by the logic of the military, the logic of geopolitics. And a lot of times we have, including, with Sputnik and Gagarin and so on. So you do have these kind of purely symbolic elements that are not kind of tethered fundamentally to the kind of earthly power struggles. But a lot of times the symbolic elements are doing some serious cover-up work for the earthly kind of, because I don't think you could sell some of those projects, as well and get the kind of enthusiasm and support behind them as well, if you were selling them as purely about human power,
Fascinating. We have a number of questions, and we have a fantastic audience, and in our audience are people who specialize in these topics. Here's one for you, Victoria. The Soviet project for atheism in the context of space exploration is fascinating. Has this project always been consistent throughout the USSR, or has the narrative changed from one general secretary to another?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, and it's a very good question, but it's a bit tough to kind of map out quickly. I think what has been consistent throughout the position, the ideological position of religion and atheism in the Soviet project never changed. That remained consistent. However, how those two categories, both religion and atheism, and the role of science within them were defined did change. So I think that there is a kind of a moment in which the kind of the narrative of science versus religion really was a narrative that was deeply and fundamentally tied to the modernization project. And it really comes into its own under Khrushchev as part of this platform of building communism, right, of entering a new era, when the church itself is no longer kind of a political enemy within Soviet borders, but is now actually working within the state as a kind of patriotic institution in support of its agenda. So now you're no longer fighting religion, you're fighting belief, right? You're fighting kind of superstition, backwardness, and so on. So I think it does change in really key ways, and it even changes in terms of the kind of the label that's used, because in the early Soviet period, it's referred to as militant atheism, whereas in the late Soviet period, it becomes scientific atheism. So this kind of militancy is no longer the central feature of the atheist project.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Here's a question for you, Andy. This is from Alexei Golubyov. You discussed the current political use of Gagarin and the Soviet space program in terms of the sacred and sacralization. What about their place in the production of rationality in present-day Russia? And he says in the VDKNK pavilion, it's framed in more than just sacredness.
Well, this is a great point, and I read that question as well. There's Alexei talks about the Smithsonian, right? We don't think of the Smithsonian as a sacred space, and actually, I think I would disagree. And I think that representations of science and of technology tend toward sacralization, public representations. And there are of course geeky and wonky ways of presenting technology and science, but when it comes to popular representation, they tend to be plugged into heroic narratives that have sort of sometimes thinly veiled and sometimes not so thinly veiled political points that are being made, and also points that tie into patriotism. And also, I think, into more generally the doctrine of progress, that there is a kind of teleological notion built into most science and technology displays that are a manifestation of national or of universal progress towards some sort of better goal. And so I think if we read exhibits carefully, we begin to see that they're dealing in the sacred terrain. They're not dealing in the explanation that engineers and scientists might conduct at their conferences, or as they are designing particular things. And so that's my answer, but I'm perfectly open to challenges to that.
Thank you. For you, from John Posada, Victoria, how has the return of widespread religion in post-Soviet countries affected the modern vision of Gagarin and the Soviet era space science technology?
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and what's been fascinating to watch, as I've been, kind of following the story for the last, I don't know, 15 years or so, is that the atheist aspect of it has basically been written out. So even in the planetarium, the planetarium, much like the VDNH pavilions, fell into disrepair for many years, was kind of had been abandoned as a space, and was only rebuilt, I think maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but rebuilt in this really, kind of state of the art, beautiful way. And in the kind of historical section of that planetarium, at no point, it kind of talks about why it was founded and what they did there. And at no point is it ever mentioned that this was about scientific enlightenment, or that this was, or that this was about, atheist propaganda. Gagarin, not only that, Gagarin himself generally kind of resisted becoming part of that narrative. He did not embrace the kind of, I went to space and did not see God. That was really much more cosmonaut number 2, German Titov. Gagarin, in fact, has become reappropriated as a religious figure. And that's what's there's a kind of emphasis that Gagarin was never an atheist, that Gagarin was baptized. And not only that, but that it was Gagarin who was central to the restoration of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, that he was the one that kind of initiated that process and kind of pushed for it as an important national monument, right? So in a way, the kind of that whole story has been not, I wouldn't even say forgotten, I think erased, right? And deliberately kind of erased and obfuscated in favor of a kind of nationalist, patriotic space program that has nothing to do with these kinds of unseemly qualities.
Thank you. Here's one from Julianne First. Do you see any relationship between the Gagarin and space cult with the late 1980s Soviet love for the supernatural and paranormal? Did the science cult inadvertently prepare the ground for its version, since it was so tied up with political success of the Soviet project? And if you could answer that, Victoria, and then maybe Andy has something to say.
Yeah, I was going to ask if that. I wasn't sure if that was for me. Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful question, I'm sure, and I'm glad that it's raised, because one of the things that really interests me about this is the decline, actually, of cosmic utopianism and enthusiasm, and as I'm sure a number of the people here know, the decline of the kind of confidence in the continuation of Soviet progress in space, which happens really precipitously after the Americans kind of take the lead with landing on the moon, which kind of shifts the narrative. gives way to a kind of malaise in that arena. And instead, what becomes much more, it coincides with a different, a related but not kind of causal trend, which is this kind of turn to mysticism, various forms of new religious movements. And many of these do, in fact, adopt a kind of scientism, including kind of, presenting astrology as a kind of science, ufology. So I think that is something that is distinct to the Soviet project, whereas these new religious movements were widespread, globally, really, in this beginning in the late 60s and through the 70s. What makes them distinct in the Soviet case is how scientistic they were. As opposed to, kind of more mystical. So there's much more of that, I think, than you would normally find in, in these kind of new religious spaces.
Do you have a comment, Andy?
Yeah, I did, because this is actually something, it's a subject of my forthcoming book, and one chapter deals with the development of sort of extrasensory perception and alternative ways of knowing, and the attempt to fuse that with science. And it happens through the Soviet American exchanges sponsored by the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. And that actually begins in the early 1970s, and the cosmonauts and astronauts are very closely associated with that, particularly Alexei Leonov and then Russell Schweikert on the American side. And they had what Frank White termed the overview effect, that when you see the Earth from space, you have this aha moment, a feeling of cosmic connectedness and all that sort of thing. And that was very much tied to Earthrise and the image of Apollo 8, seeing the moon rise over the Earth. And this created a kind of a consciousness that connected the enterprise of space exploration also with a kind of secular spiritualism. And that was perfectly appropriate in the Soviet context. You can be an atheist and a secular spiritualist at the same time and experience cosmic connectedness. And I think that this is really something that emerges big time in the 70s, but also connects with similar trends of astrofuturism and ideas of escaping into a spiritual realm, into the heavens, that are current in not only in the United States, but in Europe as well.
Thank you. Let me follow up with a last question for both of you, which will bring us right up to the present. What parallels can we draw between these ideas and the Elon Musk ideology operating in the US? How do we expect the narrative, effect, reaction to be different, the same in the US? Will this be used here to co-promote atheism? Is a utopia being sold to people which can be used for other motives? Why don't you start, Andy, and we'll go to Victoria, end with Victoria.
Yeah, geez, this is, of course, this is the occupational hazard of an historian trying to comment on things going on in the current world. But I see it this way, right? As I think about the history of space exploration as not only a Soviet, but a global phenomenon, there's a space race, right? Where you compete with each other to get higher into space and to have these feats, like Gagarin, Sputnik, the first man on space, the first spacewalk, and all this kind of on the moon, and all that kind of stuff. And then there is the era of collaboration, which begins with the Apollo-Soyuz test project, and then continues on up through the legacy of that, the International Space Station. But then within that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there is this move toward privatization. And privatization actually was encouraged very much by Reagan. Militarization and privatization were the two watchwords of the Reagan era for a space program. And I think Elon Musk comes out of that. And he gets a lot of his contracts, right, doing military business. That's not something that people talk about a lot, but that's what gives him a lot of the money to fund his projects. And commercialization, of course, is something that the Soviets participated in. As the Soviet Union collapsed, they could give people rides into space and launch satellites in exchange for money. Not something that they did previously. Well, they did it previously, they just didn't ask for money. This is, I think, the new era of the commercialization of space. And I'm not sure how that connects up with utopianism. In some ways, I think it kills it. And that it just turns it into another aspect of consumerism and business and profit making. And that's kind of where we are now. I'm not sure that the glorious sort of utopian era of the 70s and 80s can be recaptured.
Victoria.
Yeah, I would actually disagree a little bit with Andy on that one, because Well, I don't think we have to worry about atheism. I think atheism is done, right? And I think the link with atheism on in the kind of science religion framework, it continues to have its kind of contingent in the new atheists and so on. But I don't think anyone in the space community is kind of using this as to buttress the project. But where I would part ways with Andy is on this utopianism, because I see the Musk project as the promise that is made of colonizing Mars, of moving ordinary humans to, to Mars to live in large numbers within the intermediate future, near to medium range future, is completely utopian. And while what he's actually engaged in is precisely these military commercial enterprises, what he's talking about is not that. He's talking about colonizing Mars. He's talking about making humans into a multi-planetary species in order to avoid human extinction. Right. So I think they're absolutely still engaged in a kind of, in a kind of collaboration, these two narratives. And the utopianism, the amount of utopianism that has come back, at least in the kind of new space race on the commercial, the kind of corporate space race, including with Bezos, not just Musk, Bezos, who wants to build these space colonies, in near Earth orbit. I mean, these are completely utopian projects, yet they are absolutely funneling a lot of the technological and scientific funding and progress that's taking place.
I just want to add to that Victoria, you convinced me that your clarification, I'm convinced.
Thank you, Andy. We're out of time, unfortunately. I've really enjoyed this. I've learned a lot. If any of you in the audience want to stick around, we'll be here for a few more minutes. But thank you. We're formally concluding the project right now, though we have a lot more questions and a lot more interest. So big applause for you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
There's another good question here. The relationship between the emancipatory and the national imperialism and the sacralization of the space campaign, and how this relationship has evolved since 1991. Though sacralization remains, utopianism seems to have faded. And maybe you just answered that. But they're talking about, post of the revival of religion, Chernobyl, etc. That, that's a techno-utopianism that the Soviets have specialized, seems to be on the wane.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, again, as historians, we're kind of fumbling in the dark when we start trying to understand the world around us. There's this kind of impulse to be like, give me like 20, 30 years and then I'll kind of see the contours a little bit more clearly. But I do think that in the post-Soviet case, the Russian case, there was so much invested, so much hope invested in the symbolism that we discussed. And I do think there's a kind of utopian nostalgia that remains. But one thing that was pointed out to me that that I had not thought about by the historian, oh gosh, I'm forgetting. There's so many space historians that are in my head now. But a prominent and important space historian was that, even after the dissolution of the USSR, they never abandoned the crude, or what used to be called manned space program, humans in space. Cosmonauts never went away, even though it made no kind of economic sense, right, to a country that's undergoing tremendous, economic turmoil. And yet they remained committed to it despite everything, even through the 90s, when everything else was kind of falling apart, the cosmonauts remained. and they continue to kind of work. You know, the space program, though it wasn't in its heroic age, it was never kind of put aside in favor of earthly projects that could have, you know, they could have redirected those resources elsewhere, the way that, for example, we did in the US after Apollo. But there was still this kind of, you know, connection and attachment to it, which I think is important to note.
Yeah.
I think that for me, what's really interesting about that too is this concept in history of technology studies of technological momentum, and that technological infrastructures create a momentum of their own that can transcend the political context.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I realize I have office hours, so I'm going to run over to my Zoom office. But it's great to see you two. I hope we can catch up soon in person.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for organizing this. It was such a
Well, that was
delight.
all thanks to Elizabeth. No.
Oh, to everybody. God, to Elizabeth, to all of
Yeah.
you. It was really lovely. And, you know, I wish it were in person because there's so many great questions. So would have had, you know, we would have had a chance to kind of, you know, metabolize them a little bit longer, but you know, to better days.
Yes, to better days.
Thank
Okay. Take care, you all.
Great
Bye-bye.
stuff. Bye all.